In the Mesolithic, though scant, we could find evidence of prehistoric man relatively easily. But as we head further into our distant past, the archaeological survivals become increasingly obscure. The era before the Mesolithic is termed the Paleolithic, dating from 7000 BC all the way back to the arrival of the first Homo sapien in Britain. Upper Paleolithic man first arrived in Britain around 12,000 BC with the retreat of the Great Late Devonian ice sheet. When the ice melted, a barren and scarred land was left behind. Indeed, although the major ice sheet would have melted in a matter of decades, glaciers clung on in the highlands and mountains of Snowdonia and the Lake District until at least 10,000 BC. With so much water locked up in the ice sheets, sea levels were significantly lower, and England was still joined to the continent. Where we now have the North Sea and English Channel, there would have been vast plains of wildwood, interrupted only by a few rivers and lakes. With the melting of the glaciers and retreat of the great ice sheet across northern Europe, sea level began to rise and the forest quickly succumbed to the rising water. But the scoured post-glacial landscape quickly turned to tundra before the succession of pioneer plant communities resulted in the first great forests of birch and pine, now pushed to the tops of our highest hills. As with Mesolithic people, Paleolithic men were hunter-gatherers. They tracked across the landscape following herds of wild game, but they can be distinguished from their predecessors quite easily by their more primitive stone tools. They were crude, multi-purpose stone and flint tools used for hacking, cutting and scraping. These few discarded implements and occasional bones are all we have of him in the Peak District. In the Manifold Valley we have a small regional group of caves, but they are of national importance for the fantastic survival of archaeological evidence within them. Behind me is the sheer limestone face of Ossum's Crag. At the base of a 40-metre high cliff, a narrow water-worn passage leads down into the earth. Here is one of the best sites that we have for understanding Paleolithic man in the Manifold Valley. The small cave slopes down for just over 5 metres until it becomes flooded and further exploration isn't possible, but it's unlikely that Paleolithic man ever went this deep. In the base of the crag behind me you can see the entrance to Ossum's Cave. Unfortunately it's inaccessible in the winter, the river being in full flow, and even if you could get across, the slippery slopes are a quagmire of decaying leaves. When excavations took place in the cave some 80 years ago, several important finds were made, but surprisingly they were not from inside the cave where relatively little was discovered, but instead just outside on a small platform which extended from the cave mouth. I attempted a visit in the summer, but the undergrowth was so dense and so high that the cave was impossible to access. These photographs show the brooding cliff and dark entrance hidden amongst the trees. In the 1950s, excavations on the platform in front of the cave revealed many fascinating Paleolithic artefacts. 6 white flint implements were discovered, including a backed blade, scraper and boned point. They were associated with an area of charcoal, and within the dark material were the bones of reindeer. A radiocarbon date of roughly 11,000 years was obtained from the flint, giving us definitive evidence of Paleolithic man hunting, cooking and enjoying temporary shelter in the Manifold Valley. Across the valley is Elderbush Cave. Reindeer bones were also discovered here, but in this cave Paleolithic man created a stone box-like structure to store them in. It's interesting to consider why he would do this. A Stone Age dustbin? For carving into implements, or for religious reasons. From the side of Ossum's Cave, a small block passage leads high up into the cliff, probably to link with another cave, Ossum's Eyrie, 30 metres above the ground. This would have been too difficult to access by prehistoric man. Even the archaeological excavators had to use 10 metres of rope to descend the face. But inside, more ancient animal remains were discovered. The name, meaning eagle's nest, links back to the tale that this small cave was once a nesting site for golden eagles. Across the valley, other caves yielded even more ancient remains. Behind me is the imposing face of Four's Cave, which dominates the central part of the Manifold Valley. Often frequented by visitors, they enter into the large cave mouth before exploring the narrow passages behind, which lead to the Bat Roost. But on the right-hand side of the main cave is a narrow fissure which leads down into the earth. Only accessible by rope, this was excavated between 1927 and 1935 by the Reverend Wilson and his so-called Brotherhood of the Pick and Shovel. Inside they found a variety of Paleolithic animals no longer with us, from brown bear to wolf and ox. And inside they also found the remains of a plethora of other creatures which are still with us today within the Peak District. Practically all our evidence for Paleolithic man comes from caves. And there's a simple reason for that. Over the last million years, glaciers have continually eroded and scoured the landscape of the British Isles. But the caves that lie in some of our deep gorges, especially in the limestone country, offered some protection, not just from the glaciers but also from the other elements. Inside, all of the ancient deposits have been slowly buried by sediment, leaving archaeologists a perfect stratigraphy to allow us to examine the remains of our ancient past. But these features themselves can also change over time. I'm standing just in front of the rock shelter at Demon'sdale. It may not look like much now, but 100 years ago it was excavated to reveal some fascinating remains. Many of them were from more modern times, such as the Roman era, but there were some remains that could date even back to the Paleolithic. However, in this case, it's very difficult to get evidence from the site because many of the finds have been lost over the past century and the rock shelter itself has now collapsed and changed, so the original evidence is no longer visible. This provides a tantalising clue to what may lie hidden in the rest of the Peak District. As we travel back before the late Devonian ice sheet, we struggle for any evidence of prehistoric man in the Peak District. From remains uncovered around Britain, we know hominids have inhabited these islands for at least 500,000 years. But this habitation was sporadic, as it was a time of massive climatic fluctuation. Although the last ice sheet waxed and waned some 14,000 years ago, this was just one of a series of glaciations spanning over 1,000,000 years. Between each new ice age, known as a stadial, was a warm period known as an interstadial. This means that during the Middle Paleolithic, it would have been both much warmer and much cooler than it is today. Finds of mammals in Britain from this period have ranged from elephants to reindeer. As the climate fluctuated between the ice ages, so too would have the environment, and this accounts for the wide variety of animals present in the archaeological record. Modern-day Homo sapiens, whose evidence we found at Ossum's Cave, first entered northern Europe some 47,000 years ago. It is likely these hominids originated in Africa, before spreading out across the continents. There are a variety of other hominids that evolved in Africa before Homo sapiens. One of them had a much greater presence in Britain, Homo neanderthalis. Neanderthals originated in Africa some 225,000 years ago. Shorter and stockier than modern-day humans, they also had a much larger cranial capacity. For evidence of Neanderthal man, we must again look to caves. In this case, Ravenscliff Cave, high above Cresbrookdale in the Wye Valley. On the day we went to film, the limestone cliffs, hundreds of feet high, were covered in an eerie grey shroud. I had never visited Ravenscliff Cave before, but had a grid reference and was determined to track it down. 43,000 years ago, just like Homo sapiens in the Upper Paleolithic, Neanderthals were following reindeer across the Peak District. The climate was much colder than 12,000 years ago, however, being more equivalent to modern tundra environments, with the now barely imaginable sight of woolly mammoths and other megafauna feeding on the scrubby grasses. It's hard to imagine the scene now when confronted with screes, cliffs and woodland of modern Cresbrookdale. It is still slipping. Nothing's ever easy. swear on camera. Unfortunately, filming does not always go to plan. The raw footage from this documentary constituted over 24 hours of material, and through some miracle, every single place I wanted to film, I'd made it to. But after several hours of scrambling in the mist, it was taking its toll.
Byron, sometimes you just have to accept you tried your best, but you just can't succeed.
Oh god, I've got to come all the way back down to get up again now. With a heavy heart, we began the long scramble back to the summit of Cresbrookdale. Sometimes you just have to accept defeat. As Pat said, you can't take these risks, you can't make these chances. If there's a chance you might hurt yourself. Now, we've just spent the last 2 hours climbing around on the cliff faces and horrible slopes on the edge of Cresbrookdale, trying to find Ravencliff Cave to show you and explain what it was like for Neanderthal man. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. And so back up on the cliffs where it's utterly bizarre. I mean, it's grey there, it's grey below. It feels like you're floating, but in fact there's several hundred feet below you. Got to accept that it's the limit, and unfortunately you're going to have to make do with some pretty drawings and excavation photos from the past. But maybe it's somewhat fitting that the final destination is at the limit of what we can do and something that eludes us. But this is pretty much as far back in time as we can go in the Peak District. But for me now, I'm off for a well-earned green tea. After a rather nice clotted cream tea, we headed down to the base of Cresbrookdale to see if we could see the cave from there. We could not. We were even tempted to get out the GPS and try again from the base of the valley, but common sense prevailed. I didn't want this to be my last documentary. So here is the moment you've all been waiting for. This is Ravenscliff Cave. Well, it's not exactly Thor's Cave, but it is a fascinating place. Excavations within Ravencliff took place in the late 1920s, and along with woolly rhinoceros, bear and reindeer bones, a double scraper used by Neanderthals was discovered from the Middle Paleolithic. A small but tangible piece of evidence, it can now be seen on display in Buxton Museum. So why is it that caves are our best source of evidence of ancient man? The erosion and redeposition of sediment and materials by changing glaciers and rivers over the millennia means that practically all surface remains of early man have either been disturbed or destroyed. Only caves, which offer some protection, especially from aerial weathering, have preserved ancient remains. But this also raises a problem. Did Paleolithic man always live in caves, or was it just extreme conditions that drove him there? Perhaps they liked the security, or maybe they were used for ritual. Could some of the human remains themselves have been the prey of other predatory animals? I'm sure you too have your own questions, and this is one of the most exciting aspects of delving back into the Old Stone Age. Many questions, but few answers. Maybe one day we will find evidence to answer some of them. So I have mentioned the origin of Neanderthals, but what happened to them? Early archaeologists believe that modern humans may have hunted them to extinction, but recent evidence has shone light on the most likely events that led up to their demise. Neanderthals were much better adapted than other early hominids to survive in the cold conditions of northern Europe, but around 40,000 years ago, with the approach of a new ice age, many died in the extreme cold, and those who survived were forced south. Here they encountered the new and highly successful Homo sapiens. Those Neanderthals that remained were simply outcompeted by modern humans, finding it much more difficult to hunt game in the warmer environments. But it appears that we did not consider Neanderthals so different from ourselves, and evidence has been found that many Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. After all, our DNA only differs from theirs by 0.12%. The Neanderthals died out around 39,000 BC, but in a small way they live on. Recent genetic analysis of modern Europeans has shown that on average 2% of our genome is Neanderthal. We all still have a bit of Paleolithic man within us. This twisted Acheulean hand axe is the most ancient man-made artefact yet found in the Peak District. 70,000 years ago, this tear-shaped tool is one of the few lower Paleolithic artefacts found in Britain. It was discovered at 220 metres above sea level on the limestone near Hopton, but this is unlikely to be its original location, as the glaciers and meltwater rivers that have repeatedly crossed our land are likely to have transported it for many miles. We have now passed the limit of evidence for the Peak District's human history. The history of our earliest hominid ancestors is unclear at best, but during warm periods, each glaciation over the last million years, they would have colonised and left Britain in equal measure. A site has recently been discovered near Happisburgh that contains flints from at least 800,000 years ago, but only one clear piece of in situ archaeological landscape from the lower Paleolithic survives, discovered near Boxgrove in West Sussex. When Earthen Pit Quarry was closed in the 1980s, excavations revealed that beneath lay the perfectly preserved remains of a 500,000-year-old prehistoric land surface. A buried chalk sea cliff was discovered which would have overlooked a long, flat beach. Continued investigation has revealed an impressive 26-kilometre-wide section of this prehistoric landscape is preserved around Earthen Pit. Beyond the chalk beach, the landscape 500,000 years ago was one of grassland with occasional scrub and open pools. A fragment of tibia from Homo heidelbergensis marks the earliest fragment of ancient man that we have yet found in Britain. He would have stood around 1.8 metres high and weighed roughly 80 kilograms. Along with a fragment of bone, there are also spreads of flint knapping debris, showing that the ancient hominids were producing hand axes and other flint tools for hunting. Lower Paleolithic man would have shared his landscape with many other creatures, and a wide variety of animal bones were found at Boxgrove, including lion, bear and rhino. One recent hypothesis from studying the remains of the ancient elephant in Britain has suggested that Homo heidelbergensis may even have driven them off cliffs or into bogs to make killing them easier. Bones of the game animals at Earthen Pit show they were expertly butchered, and this is probably what attracted the human hunters to the area. Gruesomely, both ends of the prehistoric man's tibia show signs of gnawing, possibly by a wolf. This suggests that the individuals from Boxgrove may have occasionally fell prey to other animals themselves. These fascinating insights are all we have into our most distant of ancestors. Old Stone Age man had to adapt and live within the confines of the environmental pressures placed upon him, something we now find it hard to imagine since New Stone Age man began those first steps into making us the most successful species on planet Earth.